Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is a short piece of writing called Nearer to God in a Garden. The kiss of the sun for pardon, the song of the birds for mirth. One is nearer God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth. God's Garden, lines 13 to 16, poems by Dorothy Frances Gurney, 1913. I am more than aware that God's Garden is not a proverb or in any way an ancient verse, only having been published in 1913, but in many ways it has become so. It holds truths of a higher nature. The truth to me is clear. Of course you feel the beauty of the world when you step into your own natural enclosed space and when you feel yourself kissed by the sun. And you may not feel it, but it is present just as strongly when the garden is filthy, cold, wet, colourless and unproductive. The power of the elements, the unforgiving winter, the sprouting expectant spring. My garden is of ultimate importance to me at the moment, not least of all because my recent low spell coincided with its burgeoning and sprouting time. The contrast of my low and the garden's high was compelling. I needed to challenge and force myself to be in a place for which I was responsible, and yet was not responsible. I can't make plants grow, force cuttings to root, prevent frost damage to a seedling. That's something else entirely. I'm not unskilled or inexperienced, as I've spent much of my life surrounded by plants and gardens. I lived on agricultural communes when I was in my late teens, and moved into a 1950s semi in Bolton with Gary shortly after. He was a good and gentle guy, and we lived together for 4 years. From the moment I moved in, I set to work on his garden, which was the most basic setup, comprising only lawn and paving. I dug a pond in which I kept koi carp, and a murky tench which would appear from the pond's depths to eat the food I sprinkled, then skulk back down again. I also planted my very first little tree, an Acer palmatum dissectum. Funny how I remember that name so clearly even now. I planted a dwarf silver birch and a holly for Yuletide berries. It is said that there are none who show more belief in the future than those who plant trees. Perhaps that's true, but in my case I don't know. I was young and enthusiastic, and I'm not sure how much I thought of the future. At any rate, I loved my garden time. I remember the joy of my first proper garden very well, especially my failed attempts at overwintering the crop of water chestnuts and the not-so-apparent joys of one year's crop of utterly enormous Jerusalem artichokes. Neighbours complained because they blocked out their light. I spent hours in that garden while Gary was at work. I was busy, alone, and perfectly happy. Years later, when I married Donald, we moved into another 1950s suburban semi. But every time I stepped outside, my neighbour would shout hello through her dining room window and would come out to chat. It drove me bonkers. Where had my quiet time gone? I didn't just enjoy the quiet time, I needed it. I needed the time to get my hands dirty and speak to the worms, apologise for disturbing them, and to stroke the leaves of my favourite plants. So I gradually lost joy in the garden, only going in when the neighbours were out. It didn't help that our garden also backed onto a golf course, so there was always disturbance of some type. Golfers shouting in their brightly coloured clothes didn't help me achieve my hermit dreams. Later, when I first had the children and lived in a 2-up-2-down red brick terrace, I was urbanised, but luckily still had my own tiny enclosed strip of land. When I saw that I was one of the very few houses on my road that had greenery in the back, I was delighted, but I was wrong to have been. My neighbour offered to help, then completely took over, spending hours and hours out there when he had ostensibly turned up to assist me with toddler and baby. The garden should have been my space, but had quickly become alien, and my garden god was disappeared. I've been living here for 12 years now. Shortly after we first moved in, we kept hens, and the garden was always busy, messy and noisy, not least of all because the kids would dig wherever they could to find worms for the birds. But now my raised vegetable beds are full of healthy soil, growing plants and worm colonies. When we first moved in, I could only do garden work when the kids were asleep or when they were being cared for, occasionally by my parents. Otherwise it was pointless. They would constantly demand my attention and were too young to help. But now, when I'm outside, the only disturbances are from the road traffic and from people outside the garden. I just listen to Radio 4 Extra on the headphones, and that drowns out the noise a little. Oh, it's pretty out there, with the colour scheme of pale grey-green, mauve, dark green and dark red. And there's so much growing too. Carrots, potatoes, onions, spinach, mange too, salad greens, watercress, parsnips, artichoke, the globe kind, not the towering Jerusalems, rhubarb, strawberries, white currants, red currants, black currants, and green and red gooseberries. There are herbs aplenty, and some oddities such as tayberries and red-veined sorrel too. Best of all, in front of a now painted filing cabinet that's been converted to a massive outdoor planter, I have placed a little bench that looks onto a new tree. The tree is a rowan, my dad's favourite, and I have surrounded the tree with primroses, daffodils and strawberries in tribute to both my parents. Later in the year I'll add snowdrops, and will remember the joy Mum and Dad took in walking to Astley Park in winter just to witness those sharp white flowers peeping up to herald the spring. So, gardens. At first they were my joy, then were my pain, and now again my garden is my joy. It tells stories to me of birth and death, vibrancy and withering, success and failure, and of the changing of the seasons. I take humble pride at humanity's insignificant attempts at creation, and I experience the powerlessness of a guardian in the face of elements whose control is far greater than the mere caretaker's.